"Hey, that fence is city property. We don't need help from drifters." The old man looked up. His hands were covered in dirt and splinters. He didn't answer, just kept hammering quietly. Some folks crossed the street to avoid him, but by sunrise the next day something changed. Military flags lined that same fence unit by unit, battle by battle. If this hit you in the heart, comment respect. Walter Matthews didn't ask for much from life these days. At 74, the retired Army veteran lived alone in a modest house on Cedar Lane, at the quiet edge of Millbrook. His daily routine was a masterpiece of simplicity. Coffee at dawn, a walk through the neighborhood before the world fully awakened, then a few hours tending to his vegetable garden or reading on his porch. He wore the same tan canvas jacket, regardless of season boots worn smooth at the heels, and a faded army cap that had long ago lost its crisp shape. The few neighbors who knew him described Walter as a man of few words but consistent kindness, the type who would shovel your driveway after a snowstorm and be gone before you could offer thanks. Every Sunday morning, Walter walked the long way to St. Michael's Church, not because he was particularly religious, but because the rhythm of the service reminded him of military order, predictable, structured, comforting in its unchanging nature. This particular Tuesday morning, his usual route took him past the church grounds, where last night's windstorm had left its mark. The white wooden fence that bordered the property had partially collapsed, several panels lying broken on the grass posts leaning at precarious angles. Walter stopped, looked around. No one was there. No maintenance crew, no church staff, no volunteers addressing the damage. After a moment's consideration, he continued his walk home. 30 minutes later, he returned carrying a small, worn toolbox. Without ceremony, he set to work, straightening posts, replacing rotted wood, carefully extracting bent nails, and replacing them with new ones from his pocket. For hours, he worked in methodical silence, measuring, cutting, hammering. His weathered hands moved with the confidence of someone who had built and repaired many things over many years. Midway through the afternoon, a woman walking her dog paused on the sidewalk. She observed Walter's progress with narrowed eyes. "Shouldn't you be asking permission before messing with church property?" she called out. Walter looked up, briefly nodded once in acknowledgement, then returned to his task. Later, a city groundskeeper pulled his truck alongside the curb. "Sir," he called through his open window. "That's public property. You don't just start touching things without authorization." Again, Walter nodded without argument and continued working. "He probably just wants attention," the groundskeeper muttered to a passerby. As the afternoon wore on, two teenagers passed by, slowing to watch the old man work. One pulled out his phone filming, while the other narrated with exaggerated documentary tones. "And here we see DIY Grandpa in his natural habitat, still thinks he's building bunkers for the war." They laughed as they continued down the sidewalk, the video already being uploaded to their social media. By sunset, the fence stood properly again, straight, secure, each picket aligned with military precision. Walter gathered his tools, wiped his brow, and taped a small handwritten note to the gate. Fixed with respect, no charge. He walked home in the gathering dusk, unaware that behind him someone had already torn down his note and tossed it into a nearby trash can. The next morning dawned clear in cool autumn, asserting itself in the crisp air. Walter followed his usual route past St. Michael's, allowing himself a small measure of satisfaction at the sight of the repaired fence standing straight against the blue sky. His satisfaction faded when he drew closer. Someone had scrawled "Do not touch" across the gate in harsh red marker, the letters large and accusatory. His note was gone, as if his effort had been not just unappreciated, but actively rejected. Walter paused, studying the graffiti with a carefully neutral expression. After a moment, he continued his walk, his pace perhaps a bit slower than before. Later that same morning, as Walter was returning home with a small bag of groceries, he spotted the city groundskeeper from yesterday standing by the church fence. The man held a clipboard and appeared to be making notes. When he saw Walter approaching, his expression hardened. "Hey, you're the guy from yesterday," he called out, waving his clipboard. "There's a report filed. You moved city-installed materials without a permit. That's technically vandalism, you know?" Walter stopped grocery bag hanging from one hand. "Was just trying to help," he said quietly, his voice roughened by age and sparing use. The groundskeeper shook his head. "Well, next time ask. We don't need random veterans fixing things their way. There are procedures." A woman emerged from the church's side door, keys jingling in her hand. She glanced between Walter and the groundskeeper. "Is there a problem, Ted?" she asked. "This is the guy who messed with the fence," Ted explained. "I'm writing it up now." The woman's gaze settled on Walter, taking in his worn clothes and faded cap. Her expression showed neither gratitude nor kindness. "You people think everything is about you and your wars," she said, each word precise and cutting. "This is a church, not a memorial." Walter lowered his gaze to the sidewalk, his shoulders dropping almost imperceptibly. "We had a maintenance plan," Ted added. "You just messed it up. Now we have to check if it's even up to code." Neither offered thanks. Neither acknowledged the hours of labor or the care evident in every repaired picket. To them, Walter was an intrusion, not a helper. A young mother walked by, holding her child's hand. The boy pointed at Walter, curiosity in his eyes. "Who's that man?" he asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Nobody," his mother replied, pulling him along. "Just keep walking." Walter stood motionless for a moment longer. Then, with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his life since returning from a war, few remembered, he nodded once to the groundskeeper and the churchwoman and continued his way home. His pace was noticeably slower than usual. His hands, still bearing splinters from yesterday's work, remained at his sides rather than swinging naturally with his stride. To anyone watching carefully, the weight he carried had nothing to do with the grocery bag. He didn't return to the fence after that. Instead, as evening settled over Millbrook, Walter sat alone on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that reminded him of places far away and long ago. "I'm sorry, but I had to pause after this part. How could someone who gave so much be treated like this? If you believe he deserved better, type unfair in the comments. Let's stand for those who stood for us." Before the first light of dawn touched, St. Michael's steeple movement stirred around the church grounds. Shadowy figures moved with purpose along the fence line, their work conducted in near silence with occasional whispers and the soft rustling of fabric, the only sounds disturbing the night's quiet. By the time early morning prayer attendees arrived at 6:30 a.m., the transformation was complete, and striking enough to stop them in their tracks. The once plain white fence now stood adorned with military flags, dozens of them, spaced at perfect intervals along its entire length. Each small flag had been carefully mounted, and each bore a small, laminated tag identifying a military unit in conflict. 2nd Infantry Division, Vietnam; 101st Airborne, Iraq; Marine Recon, Korea; Navy Seabees, Pacific Theater, Waputtuquod. The flags represented every branch of service, every major conflict in living memory. They fluttered gently in the morning breeze, creating a rippling line of colors against the white backdrop of the fence Walter had repaired. But the centerpiece, mounted precisely in the middle section where Walter had done the most extensive repairs, was something else entirely, a framed photograph protected in weatherproof plastic. It showed a much younger Walter standing in full combat uniform beside a 2-star general on an airstrip carved from dense jungle. Both men were covered in dust, their expressions serious but tinged with the unmistakable relief of those who had survived something harrowing. Beneath the photo, a typed note had been affixed. "This man built more fences than you'll ever know. Don't forget the ones who held the line." No signature, no explanation of who had placed the flags or how they knew Walter. Just a statement of fact delivered with quiet dignity. Word spread through Millbrook with the speed that only small-town revelations can achieve. By noon, people were driving past the church just to see the display. Some stopped to take photos. Others remained in their cars, watching with solemn expressions. Veterans began arriving from neighboring towns by early afternoon. One elderly man in a Korean War veteran's cap approached the fence, slowly leaning heavily on his cane. He offered a shaky salute before kneeling with considerable difficulty to place a single white rose at the base of the fence. Ted, the groundskeeper, returned shortly after lunch, clearly intending to remove what he would undoubtedly consider unauthorized decorations. He pulled up in his city truck, clipboard already in hand as he approached the fence. Then he stopped. His eyes moved from flag to flag, reading the unit designations. His gaze lingered on one in particular, 12th Engineers, Vietnam. Without a word, Ted returned to his truck and drove away. Later that afternoon, the teenagers who had mocked Walter walked by again. Upon seeing the display and Walter's photograph, the one who had filmed the mocking video pulled out his phone again. This time he deleted the original video. His face flushed with shame, As the sun began its descent, a black government SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the curb. A woman in crisp navy dress blues emerged, her posture impeccable, her movements precise. She approached the fence without hesitation, removing something from her pocket as she walked. At the gate Walter had repaired, she pinned a small, distinctive coin, immediately recognizable to anyone with military knowledge as a presidential challenge coin, one of the highest honors that could be bestowed informally. "He never asked to be honored," she said to the small crowd that had gathered. "So we'll honor him ourselves." In the hush that followed, no one spoke. No one moved. The fence Walter had fixed stood transformed, no longer merely property, but monument. Walter never publicly acknowledged the flags or the photograph. He continued his daily walks, passing by St. Michael's the following Sunday as if nothing had changed. But everything had. People who had previously avoided eye contact now turned towards him. They nodded respectfully. Some placed hands over hearts. A few veterans offered quiet salutes, which Walter returned with the same precision he had brought to fixing the fence. Children no longer asked who the old man was. Now they whispered to each other with reverence, "That's Mr. Walter. He fixed the fence." 3 weeks after the flags appeared, a small ceremony was held, organized not by the church but by a coalition of local veterans groups. A proper brass plaque was mounted on the corner post of the fence, "Restored by hand, remembered by heart." Walter attended at their insistence, but stood in the back, declining to speak when invited to the microphone. His presence was enough, a living embodiment of the quiet service the plaque commemorated. The flags eventually came down, carefully removed and preserved by the local VFO, but one remained by popular demand: the Army Corps of Engineers flag positioned where Walter had made his first repair. Walter continued his morning walks. Same boots, same quiet nod. But now every time he passed the church, he'd tip his cap, not to the building but to the memory of fallen friends represented by that single remaining flag. Subscribe to Wounds and Honor if you believe the smallest acts of respect should echo the loudest.